Today, Dr. Teale Phelps Bondaroff, our research coordinator, wants to talk to everyone on the line, on the internet, and on Facebook about our work on municipal prayers. Take it away, Teale.
Yeah, so we're trying to do more regular updates from the research desk. And as some of you who tuned in a couple of weeks ago know, we've got a lot of different research projects we're working on. I'm the research coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. And so last month we talked a lot about, or earlier this month rather, we talked a lot about all of our different projects looking at legislative prayer in the BC legislature, permissive tax exemptions, and some of the other work that we're doing. And we thought we'd do a slightly more focused talk today about our work looking at prayer in municipal councils in Canada, and also announce our next research project that's going to be involving citizen science, and we're crowdsourcing a lot of our work on the next project. And so I've got my colleague Ranil here, who's going to be talking about that project towards the end. And I wanted to encourage everyone to ask lots of different questions. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat. Ian's monitoring Facebook. I'll be monitoring the Zoom chat. And yeah, there's any question would be great. And also, we've got a couple of options as we go through the talk. If there's interest in a deeper dive into some of the arguments around legislative prayer, I'm happy to do that as well. But we'll kind of do a shorter talk, and then we can go deeper if people are interested. And yeah, so a bit more background about myself. As I said, I'm the coordinator, the research coordinator for the BC Humanists. I also do research for Oceans Asia, for whom I'm the director of research. And I'm the chair and co-founder of the Access BC campaign for free prescription contraception in BC. And you're welcome to tweet at me at TealePB. And yeah, so special thanks for this research project, in particular for our research assistants, Ranil, who's in the chat, and Noah, who conducted a lot of the heavy lifting for the project, and Ian and our other colleagues at the BCHA. And basically the plan for today is I'm going to talk a bit about Saguenay, a very important court decision by the Canadian Supreme Court on municipal prayer. And then we'll talk a bit more about our findings looking at municipalities across British Columbia to see which ones were not in compliance with that decision. And then I'll pass over to Ranil to talk a bit more about our research project that we're launching to investigate prayer in municipal councils across the country. So a bit more on Saguenay then. So in 2015, we have a fundamental court case, a very important court case that's decided. It's called the Saguenay decision. The background is pretty straightforward. Alain Simoneau, a resident of Saguenay, Quebec, was attending municipal council meetings regularly, and municipal council meetings were starting with a prayer. The mayor would lead the council in a prayer, an overtly Christian prayer. They would cross themselves at the end of the prayer, and the session would continue. Alain can voice his concerns that this excluded people who were non-believers and of Christianity and non-believers in general, and he identified himself as an atheist. And the case worked itself through the courts, eventually arrived at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor and found that municipal councils cannot start with a prayer. And the wording of the court case and the decision is incredibly powerful and strong and firm, and no municipality can start with a prayer regardless of the content of that prayer. And the court case was really, strong in its words. So for example, it described the state's duty of religious neutrality as a fundamental, important aspect of democracy. And in this sense, it's establishing that the Canadian government, has a duty of religious neutrality, which means it can neither favor nor hinder a particular belief or non-belief. And this is a democratic imperative. And I wanted to sort of quote some of my favorite parts from the decision because it's worth quoting at length. And in the decision, it says, "The state may not act in such a way as to create preferential public space that favors certain religious groups and is hostile to others. It follows that the state may not, by expressing its own religious preference, promote the participation of believers to the exclusion of non-believers and vice versa." So basically, you can't start a session of a municipal council with a prayer. It's not okay. A couple other highlights from the court decision, which are worth just pointing out. Again, as I mentioned, it was seen as a democratic imperative. This isn't just sort of a comfort or preference thing. In fact, the court case says that a free and democratic society requires the state to encourage everyone to participate freely in public life, regardless of their beliefs. And this means creating neutral public spaces. And that when you start a council session with prayer, you breach this duty of neutrality. A couple cases and points that were brought up in the court case that are worth highlighting. And as I said, I'm happy to go into the details of the arguments that come up around this issue more often. But a couple of the points that come up are the issue of, well, if you are preventing people from voicing a prayer, are you favoring atheists or non-believers? And the court was very vehement and very clear that no, this is not the case. And in fact, the judge drew a really good distinction, which I like highlighting because it kind of illustrates the nuance, but it's a very important nuance. And that's there's a difference between true neutrality and unbelief. And the court uses the following example, and I'll draw directly from the court case. And for those of you who are following along, this is paragraph 133 of the Saguenay decision. And it's actually worth reading the introduction to that because it's a really fundamental document. But this says, contrary to the respondent's arguments, abstaining does not amount to taking a stand in favor of atheism or agnosticism. The difference, which, although subtle, is important, can be illustrated easily. A practice according to which a municipal official, rather than reciting a prayer, solemnly declared that the council's deliberations were based on a denial of God would be just as unacceptable. The state's duty of neutrality would preclude such a position, the effect of which would be to exclude all those who believe in the existence of a deity. In other words, because you abstain from something doesn't mean you reject one side of the argument or not. It means you simply abstain. You truly abstain. You do not take a position. And as such, this sort of was, I think, an important point that was held out by the courts. So that's the Saguenay decision. And I might leave it at that if there's any questions before we press on. One thing, while I give people a chance to write questions, was that unlike the United States, where they have a very explicit separation of religion and state, religion and government codified in their constitution, the court found that while Canada doesn't necessarily have this, it described how there's a gradual evolution of this separation of religion and government in Canada, and that it exists, that it's fundamental, and Saguenay kind of codifies that in a broader sense. But we don't really have a clause in Canada that explicitly establishes this distinction, but it exists. Oh, if you have any other questions, please pop them in the chat. And moving along then, once we read Saguenay, we realized that this was fundamentally changing how municipal councils should behave. And so the BC Humanists decided to see how many municipalities in British Columbia were currently in compliance with the decision. Because just because the law changes doesn't mean that everyone will follow it. Some municipalities may not be aware of it. Some of them might be more recalcitrant or what have you. So last summer, we had our two amazing summer research students do some really fun research where they looked into compliance across the province. Now, there are 162 of 63, depending on when you take a look at things, municipalities in British Columbia. And we started off by messaging them all to see if they were in compliance. This wasn't the most effective approach, simply because the municipalities that were in compliance tended to get back to us and say that they were, and the ones that weren't were less likely to respond. So we then sent our researchers on the task of looking to see if the municipalities were in compliance. And there were sort of two streams in this case. The first was looking at regular meetings, so to see if a regular daily meeting, subcommittee, or what have you started with a prayer. And the second was to look at inaugural sessions. We looked at these separately because often inaugural sessions include more pomp and circumstance and tend to have more solemnizing elements, whether it's a bagpiper or a judge swearing in new councillors, or territorial acknowledgement or what have you, whereas regular daily sessions tend to have slightly less pomp and circumstance. So we looked at both inaugural and regular sessions, and we went through all the municipalities' minutes of their meetings, we watched the videos, and we looked to see if they had prayer, if they invited individuals of various religious groups to deliver prayers, or if they were delivered by members of the council or the mayor. And what we found, and we were doing this after 2015, which is when the Saguenay decision was made. In British Columbia, that was 2018, November, were the most recent inaugural sessions. And we went through them all, and we identified 23 municipalities in British Columbia that continued, despite Saguenay, to open their municipal council meetings with a prayer, specifically their inaugural sessions. We didn't identify any municipalities that regularly started their sessions with a prayer, so that was a good thing. And we did identify some municipalities that had changed their practice as a result of Saguenay, although we did recognize that it was sometimes difficult to tell. One thing that's interesting is that the procedures and practices around an inaugural meeting will often be decided by the mayor. And so they might change some years. And so just because one year there was a prayer doesn't necessarily mean that the next year there will be one, because you may have a different administration. And what we found was, I'm looking at the prayers themselves, and I'll bring up my sheet here. We found some statistics that may not surprise people. Of the 23 municipalities, we had a pretty broad spread. So we had small districts like 100 Mile House or Lake Cowichan, and we had larger municipalities like Saanich, Victoria, North Vancouver, and the city of Langley, or Langley Township, rather. And so that was kind of, there wasn't really a trend within the types of municipalities that were violating Saguenay. But the one trend that we did identify was that of the 23 municipalities that opened their sessions with prayer, all 23 of them opened them with Christian prayer. And that was a prayer delivered by an invited member of the clergy of a specific religious denomination that was identified as Christian. So, for example, looking here at Saanich, where I'm located, they had a member of the Church of the Nazarene deliver a prayer. And actually, they had two. They had a multi-faith prayer blessing delivered by a reverend from the First Unitarian Church of Victoria. And similarly, for example, in the town of Terrace, they had a member of the Salvation Army deliver a prayer. So that was an interesting trend that kind of identified a bit of a bias in the overall practices of municipal prayer. And what we've then done, because the BCHA doesn't just do peer research, we also do advocacy, and we also try to encourage people to follow the Constitution, as everyone should. We sent them letters, and we've informed those municipalities that their next inaugural session, which will be November 2022, should not include a prayer. And then we will be following up with those municipalities to ensure compliance after November 2022. And so that's kind of where the project left. I'm currently in the process of drafting our report, and that should be out sometime in the next few months. And it basically summarizes what I've just talked about with a bit more detailed information around the arguments surrounding municipal prayer and some fun examples of some of the prayers that were delivered. So yeah, what I'll do here then is I'll kind of move on to the next step in the project. So we realized that if there was a significant number of municipalities in British Columbia that were non-compliant, that was likely the case across the country. And this is obviously something we want to avoid, right? Having a prayer in a municipal council significantly excludes people and has a lot of other issues, which I'll explore after we kind of talk about the project. But it's unconstitutional at its very basic level. So we had our researchers, because we had some extra time and they were incredibly productive. We had our researchers look at municipalities in Alberta. They looked at 19 municipalities, and they found at least one, Wetaskiwin, that had started its most recent inaugural session with a prayer. And so this suggested to us that a survey of municipalities across the country would be beneficial. And so what we've done now is we've launched, and this is our official launch, and I'm very excited to say that we're officially launching our survey of municipalities and compliance for Saguenay. We'll have a better name at some point, that we're going to be launching across the country. There are 3,700 municipalities in Canada, and so that presents a bit of a challenge. But in order to tackle this problem, we've launched a crowdsourcing project, which I'm now going to pass over to Ranil, if the audio works well. And we're going to get your support and support from members of the public like you to help us research this really important issue across the country. So without any further ado, I will pass it on to Ranil. Ranil, take it away, sir.
Awesome. Thank you, Teale. If you can hear me, Teale, can you give me a thumbs up?
Yeah, it's a little quiet, but I'll turn up my volume. You're good.
Good. Awesome. So I have a bit of a janky setup here and audio on my phone, but you guys have the pleasure of viewing me in Zoom, so that's cool. But I can't hear any of you, so that's an issue while I'm talking. But if you want my attention, like wave at me or something, or let me know in the chat. So I guess the first question to address when it comes to launching this project is why are we doing it, right? And the first thing is that humanism doesn't really end at the Rocky Mountains, right? So we did some work about British Columbia, we did some work about Alberta, but there's still the rest of the country to go. And we suspect that once we get to provinces that have more municipalities, like Quebec and Ontario, we'll see more non-compliance with the Saguenay decision, but that's just, I guess, a theory that I have. And of course, the goal of this is to end prayers in municipalities altogether. I don't have to belabor the point that starting municipal, despite unconstitutionality, it also divides people. There's a separation of religion and government that should exist. And prayers are inclusive. We could go on and on. Why are they wasting taxpayer dollars praying when they could be doing other things? So the arguments against prayer are, there's a ton of them. And if you want extra reading on that, you can go into our House of Prayers report. There's 120-something pages of arguments against prayers in the BC legislature. That's fun to look at. So the objective of the project is to measure compliance and also to encourage compliance with the Saguenay decision. And measuring compliance in the long run is somewhat easy, I guess. Measuring compliance just means that we have to go to these municipal council meeting websites and watch some videos and figure out which municipalities are following the law and which ones don't feel compelled to follow the law. Maybe they don't know. But when it comes to measuring compliance, just measuring compliance is enough. There's also encouraging compliance and also forcing compliance. So if you decide to volunteer for this research project, remember that it'll result in real actions that we can take. Whether it be us telling some local humanists about how their meeting started with prayer and they can file a human rights complaint, whether it's getting a nice story in the paper about how the municipalities feel above the law. There's a number of ways that your research and your time that you put in will help. So when it comes to the challenges for this research project, the vast majority of your time is going to be spent on municipalities' websites. And, I'm pretty certain all of us have been on a municipal website at some point. I've had the pleasure of living in two very large cities, Surrey and Vancouver. So the websites are pretty darn good compared to other places. But, when you're looking at the website for Terrace or Glacier Bay or other small municipalities, you might find some really bad websites. If you're reading through council minutes and you see that they deliver prayers, but they don't have to take a video of them, that's also an issue because, if there's no video of the prayer and there's no written record of it, did it actually happen? Legally, probably, maybe it didn't happen. You also see vague meeting minutes, sometimes they'll say, and the BC legislature also does this, so bigger institutions aren't immune from these sort of issues. You'll see that they'll have vague minutes, so they'll say that, a prayer was conducted by Reverend Tim Tom from the Second Baptist Church, but they won't say what he said, or sometimes they won't even say that a prayer was delivered by this guy, and usually it's a guy. So they'll say that a prayer happened, and that's not useful to us, although it does show that they are violating Saguenay. So there's some major concerns with this. And in terms of research outputs, there's a number of outputs that Teale and Ian and I and some other board members have been talking about when it comes to this project. I guess the number one output is compliance with Saguenay. As a BC Humanist Association, humanism doesn't end at the Rocky Mountains, but of course focus is British Columbia. But ultimately, we want to stop the practice of prayer, not stop the practice of government prayer. People can do what they want. I mean, maybe you want to stop prayer altogether in the world. Whatever, I don't care. We're also looking to get this into the academic world. It's something that hasn't really been covered very much in Canadian academia, and that's something more Teale's focused on. He's more of the academic side, and I'm more of the angry atheist side, perhaps. So those are the sort of what I wanted to touch upon. If you'd like to volunteer, I'm going to put some links in the chat, and maybe Ian can post something in the comments on Facebook. There's a section on our website, bchumanist.ca/muni-prayers, which is short for municipalities. Or you can email me directly, Ranil at bchumanist.ca. And, there it is in the chat. Ian just posted that. And we'll get you set up when it comes to starting this research project.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to have Ranil coordinating this part of it. And this really builds on, if you don't mind me jumping in on this here now, Ranil, when we did our House of Prayer study, which looked at prayer in the BC legislature, we had a team of over 50 volunteers transcribe more than 850 prayers for the past 13 years. And it was really fun. We had some people doing 4 or 5 in their spare time, and then we had one person do over 200 prayers. And it was a really great way for individuals who are, say, stuck at home or have more time on their hands given the current pandemic to contribute to ongoing active research. And what Ranil said was really important. So in addition to releasing reports and writing letters, we kind of have 3 goals. One of the goals is to ensure compliance with Saguenay, which is is very important. The second one is to also determine the impact of Saguenay. Just because a court case is made doesn't necessarily mean that people are in compliance with it. And then the third one, as Ranil mentioned as well, is to ensure compliance. We can send powerful letters and get local advocates to send letters to councils to urge them to be in compliance with the law. And that's really important. So with that, that's the project. That's really great to sign up for. When you sign up, you're going to get 5 municipalities. You'll be tasked with 5 municipalities to look at, and then you can take on more as you get through those. And Ranil can probably attest to this, but it doesn't take too long to look into one municipality. Some of them have terrible websites that were designed by someone's cousin in the 1990s, but most of them are pretty good. And it takes a few minutes to research one of them, and that helps us compile this massive database of compliance and consistency with the law. And it's going to be quite impactful. And I do also like the aspect of producing not just reports from the BCHA, but contributing our research to the academic world where it gets peer reviewed. I was quite excited. Last night at 5 a.m., I submitted one of our recent reports to a journal for peer review. And so it's important because we can add our voices to the ongoing discourse and the ongoing academic discussion around these important issues and have influence beyond just British Columbia. Our House of Prayers report and our work on legislative prayer in the BC legislature has an impact not just in BC, but across Canada and potentially in other jurisdictions across the world where they continue to practice legislative prayer. And so this research does have a broader impact. And you can take a role in that by signing up on the team. And it's a great way to spend some time during COVID. So I don't know if we have any questions from the Facebook. Sorry, Ian, you both mentioned.
Yeah, no questions on Facebook yet. I can, let me turn my video back on. No questions from Facebook, but I can unmute the people who are on the line if they want to add anything or ask anything. Do mute your own personal mics if you are worried about feedback.
Hi, Omar. How are you? Howdy. So yeah, one of the conversations we had before we started here, just waiting for any other questions that folks might have, was whether we wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into the issues, and Ranil mentioned some of them, about why prayer at legislative councils, whether they're municipal councils or parliaments, is problematic. We can also wrap up here depending on people, if people want more content, but I do have some content prepared on that if people are interested. Seeing no one running for the hills, I might just go into that now if you'd like. And this kind of builds on a lot of the work we did for our House of Prayer study on legislative prayer at the legislature, but the principles are the same. And in fact, the difference between prayer at municipal councils and prayer in the legislature is that we have a definitive Supreme Court ruling that prayer in municipal councils is unconstitutional and exclusionary. That court case has not yet happened at the provincial or federal level. And Saguenay did touch upon this somewhat, and it's been touched upon in a couple other Supreme Court cases dealing with separation of religion and government and prayer. And they tend to not touch it for fear of parliamentary privilege, potentially. And we're currently, I'm working on a legal article exploring that a little bit more in detail. Personally, and one of the judges in a previous lower court ruling around prayer had a similar view. I don't think that parliamentary privilege protects people from being discriminatory. For those who aren't familiar, parliamentary privilege is the idea that people legislators have protection in the House from saying certain things that outside of the House they might be charged with, for example, libel or slander and things like that. And typically this means that the legislature can do its own thing. And so the assumption of the courts was that, okay, municipal councils we can control, but we can't have that level of control over Parliament. I don't think so, because I don't think parliamentarians or the principles of parliamentary privilege were not designed to discriminate. If you had a policy or practice in the legislature that said that members of a certain religion or gender or race were not allowed to participate, that would not be okay. And this is exactly the same thing. And other courts have said that as well. So generally speaking, some of the issues, and this is sort of building on what Ranil was saying, some of the issues with legislative prayer are, first of all, if you are a religious person, it trivializes the prayer itself, right? It takes prayer from a sacred personal act. So people who are religious may have a deep relationship with prayer that they see as effective and impactful in their lives. And it trivializes it and makes it performative. And this is kind of a problem if you take prayer seriously, right? You're taking prayer from a individual transcendent relationship with a deity and a divine to a performance at a political event, right? That's not okay. And a lot of religious people wouldn't think it would be okay. And similarly, religious books don't think it's okay. Matthew 6:5 from the Christian Bible says that when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. You weren't expecting Bible quotes at a BC Humanist talk, but that was quite impactful, just to suggest that there is a lot of discussion within faith traditions about public prayer and why it actually might degrade the process of prayer itself. Another objection that's raised against, again, a religious objection that's raised against legislative prayer, like prayer in municipal councils, is that it promotes one denomination over another, and it always will. It doesn't matter if you have the most ecumenical prayer possible. That prayer is going to exclude some members of the same faith, broader faith tradition. So, for example, if you have a prayer that might say Heavenly Father or Dear God, that distinction of the presentation of a deity as a patriarch or as a Lord is a huge issue in religions. And religions have fought wars, bloody battles throughout history, killing each other over very tiny things like what language you can speak and what does a wafer do. And so these kinds of distinctions manifest themselves in legislative prayer and will always be there. And there's other questions as well. So, for example, many members of faith traditions don't believe that you should pray in a sense of a petitionary prayer. A petitionary prayer is when you're asking God for something rather than a prayer of thanks. When you're doing a petitionary prayer, it suggests that the God character is doing something that you want to have them changed. And it's very, some faith traditions and some folks will see that as being very egotistical, to assume that your preferences should take priority over those of an eternal and omniscient being. And so even within religious sects themselves, there's debate about prayer, what kind of prayer you can deliver. And so anytime you start delivering a prayer in a legislature or a city council or anywhere, you're going to run into this problem. And it happens across, even within sects. And we see this with splits in various sects over minor issues of doctrine or over core issues. And we've seen sects as recently as this year splitting over issues of, say, gay marriage. And then if you have a prayer in a legislature or a municipal council, it's going to put one religion over another. It's just going to do that. Simply because if you pick one prayer or even several prayers. So, for example, Saanich, where I live, decided to do two prayers, which they saw as a very ecumenical and open and accepting action. Unfortunately, both those prayers were delivered by Christian preachers, and they were both sort of religious in nature, and it didn't really help because you still exclude people of other religions, right? So if you start a prayer, even a very ecumenical one, like the one they opened the Canadian Parliament with, you're going to exclude people who don't believe in a God, but you're also going to exclude people who have, say, non-theistic faith traditions. So faith traditions that don't necessarily believe in a deity as a being that has communicative abilities, but might say, for example, worship the universe or broader spirits or even polytheistic religions. And there's other problems as well. So, for example, some religions can't have their prayer delivered in a certain space. And by that I mean their prayer might require a sanctified space. It might require a certain preparation. It might require certain clothing or delivered in a certain direction. Some people may have to be present. Some people may not be allowed to be present. And so by doing that, by having a prayer in a city council, you're always going to exclude those faith groups that say, our prayer has to be delivered in a certain kind of building. So, for example, if you wanted to deliver an Orthodox Jewish prayer, you couldn't do that at a municipal council without a minyan or 13 members of the faith present, and the various other complications. So you can see suddenly only some faith traditions are represented by prayer and not others, and that's a problem. And then, of course, we get to the fundamental question, which it's necessarily exclusionary, no matter how hard you try. And court case after court case has found this, and that's in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. No matter how hard you try to be non-denominational, you're going to exclude some people. And so ultimately, some places have said, well, we can come up with a generic prayer. You can't do it without excluding some people. And I challenge anyone to try, and they will not be successful because there's such a diversity of beliefs out there. You can't possibly reflect them all. And not only are you going to exclude other believers, but you're going to exclude non-believers. You will always exclude non-believers when you're delivering a prayer because it's inherently religious. So people who aren't religious are going to be excluded. And it's worth pointing out here that there's a difference between, and Ranil drew on this as well, there's a difference between, say, like visiting a friend's church. And, as a friend, I've gone to some of my friends' church things, whether it's baptisms or choir things. That's a different setting than a municipal council, because in a municipal council, it's the state sanctioning something. So it's different when a mayor or a member who's been invited from the public delivers a prayer at a state function compared to, say, when a prayer opens at a church meeting or your friend's dinner place, dining at a friend's place, rather. And so this is the idea that the state is then sanctioning that prayer, is then endorsing that prayer and violating its duty of religious neutrality. That's the problem. And then this other idea of like the fact that you could create a prayer that would appeal to everyone, again, it presupposes and it presumes universality of belief, of some belief, and that's just not the case. There isn't universal beliefs in that sense, and any attempt to do that would fail. So yeah, those are the arguments that we tend to see against legislative prayer, and there are some arguments that have been used in support of it, and they are very lacking. And I don't want to try and straw man them here, but I'll survey them briefly as sort of an example of some of the arguments that were brought up. And by the way, all of these arguments, or many of these arguments, were brought up in the context of Saguenay. The first argument is called the God of the Preamble argument, which is basically, if you read the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, got mine over here. There we go. There we go. You should all have one handy. Why not? That's my French copy. But if you read your Canadian Charter, the preamble says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God. And so some people extrapolate from this and suggest that we are a theistic country, that we can have ecumenical and we can have non-denominational prayers, but atheists can just lump it. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. Saguenay again steps in here and clarifies, saying that no, the God referred to in the preamble is referring to a political theory and not to a specific God. And not only that, and this is putting on my favorite procedural hat, but preambulatory clauses can't trump operative clauses in any sense. So it wouldn't matter if that wasn't the case. The preamble doesn't matter. It's flowery language that establishes sort of baseline. The next argument that gets brought up a lot, and you will hear this if you are, say, talking to your councils, is that of tradition, right? And it's the ad antiquatum fallacy, which is basically that we have a tradition of opening councils with prayer, or religion has a proud tradition in our country. And this is brought up a lot when it comes to people resisting change that is going to make our society more inclusive. And unfortunately, these people are wrong. First of all, appealing to tradition is a fallacy, right? Just because something is a tradition doesn't mean that, yes, thank you. And someone pointed out you can get your free copy of the Canadian Charter, and you should send away for it. I have mine in a number of Canadian languages, which is fantastic. But yeah, we have a proud tradition of discrimination in Canada, and that's not something we should continue to propagate. So we have a tradition of excluding women from politics and voting, and members of Japanese and Chinese descent, and Doukhobors and First Nations people, and even members of the clergy were prohibited from voting and running for office in BC for a very long time. Those are not traditions we want to replicate. And so the argument from tradition is just a failed argument. And not only that, but you can find traditions that are secular, right? So at a municipal council, that might be inviting a judge to give an invocation. It might be singing songs or having flags, despite the quality of municipal flags being quite poor, and various other secular practices that we can have to reinforce tradition without excluding people from that process. A couple other arguments that get brought up in defense of legislative prayer. One is that it's a good thing to do, right? Many people think that opening a meeting with a prayer is just gives you a warm fuzzy, and it's kind of a kumbaya kind of feeling. This, of course, betrays a massive bias towards religious sentiment. It also suggests that you can't evoke those kinds of collective group feelings without evoking religious things, which again biases religion over irreligion, belief over non-belief. And that's just not the case. And when you press into this argument a bit, you find that there isn't a lot of substance to it. It tends to be people just sort of clinging to things they're comfortable with and not really thinking through the consequences of them. Another argument that gets brought up, and this is, again, was dealt with in Saguenay, is the idea of prayer promoting diversity. So when we wrote to legislators in the BC legislature about the practice of starting sessions with a prayer, several of them wrote back and said, oh, it's a great way of highlighting diversity in the British Columbian legislature. Now, of course, our findings show that it is absolutely not the case that they highlight diversity. But not only that, again, this comes down to the idea of the best way to promote diversity. This is actually written in Saguenay. And Saguenay says, the neutrality of public space, therefore, helps preserve and promote the multicultural nature of Canada. So in fact, Saguenay says the opposite, that when you have a neutral public space where everyone is free to participate, then you have, you're truly promoting diversity. And so that's kind of one of the aspects. Another thing we're going to be doing is, once we've got all these the municipalities that have that are violating Saguenay, and we hope there aren't very many, but I anticipate there are going to be at least some if the results from British Columbia hold out, is doing some analysis on them to see what religions they represent and how much diversity they are. And Ranil actually hinted at one of them, which I didn't mention, which was of gender, right? So in addition to the prayers that we found in British Columbia being just all Christian prayers of one denomination or the other, the significant percentage of them were delivered by people who identified as male. And so that's, again, another issue that comes up a lot. And we see those kinds of patriarchal structures reinforced when we privilege religious views over non-religious views, or when we don't create a neutral public space. So last few arguments that we see brought up, these are, we're getting to the end here, in defense of legislative prayer, municipal prayer. One of them is that it solemnizes occasions, right? And this is why, in particular, we're looking at both regular council sessions and inaugural sessions. As I mentioned earlier, inaugural sessions tend to have more pomp and circumstance associated with them. And this is often done to solemnize that process. And in the United States, you actually have court cases that have ruled that legislative prayer is okay. And these court cases found, built on this principle of what's called secular ceremonial deism. The idea in the United States that you have this generic non-religious deism that people can appeal to, this God of America. I like to describe it as an off-brand, sort of a president's choice. Actually, that's probably, no, not a president's choice. That brings up too much weird politics. But it's an off-brand religion that is supposed to appeal to everybody. Of course, this excludes non-believers. And I can think of a lot of ways of solemnizing an occasion that doesn't involve shutting out a lot of members of your public, whether they're members of other religious groups or non-believers. And so there's better ways to solemnize an occasion. There was a question in the chat here, which is a really good question. Were they white males? We weren't able to check in all cases. Some of the municipal councils only list the name of the person. Some of them had video, and we didn't check for race. We might go back and try that. We haven't done that, but we can maybe look into that. That's a good question. I would suspect, you said you expect so, I would expect so as well. And they weren't all men, but a vast majority of them were. I don't have the stats off the top of my head.
We know from the Scottish research
we do.
That, so in Scotland, they have legislative prayer before their parliament, but in that situation, they invite guests. And one of the things they found from their own tracking of who they've invited, and they matched that to the census data. So there's as many atheist or non-religious presenters as there are non-religious people in Scotland. But what they found is it's something like 60-70% men have presented. So it's still disproportionately. I don't know if they knew race. Scotland's a much less heterogeneous country, I think, than Canada. So I would expect they were very white, but that might still be within demographics there.
Yeah, I'm just bringing up the Scottish model here. The gender aspect was actually very strong. So they actually had a full report on this, and they try to make the people delivering the prayers in their sessions reflect the demographics of the population. But for example, in 2018 to 2016, 63% of the people presenting were male. And in 2017, 2018, sorry, the numbers are, oh, there's a typo. That's why. The 71% of the presenters were male. And I don't think they broke it down by race as well. And it does get complicated too, because that puts us in maybe a challenging epistemological and methodological perspective of determining the race or other characteristics of the person delivering the prayer, which may not be always possible. But we most often can identify gender. Yeah, good question though. Thank you. Any other questions before I press on with the last main point? Or last 2 points, rather. Yeah, so I'll let those gather up while I keep chatting here. The other two arguments that are often brought up in defense of municipal prayer, one of them is the idea and conflicting ideas of state neutrality. And I kind of already touched on this one, but there are different versions of state neutrality. One of our other research projects that we're looking at looks at permissive tax exemptions, which are tax exemptions given to, say, places of worship. And within this overall debate around taxes and prayer, you see different conceptions of what it is for the state to be neutral, right? Some people think that when the state says you can't start a meeting with prayer, they're being excluded. And as I already mentioned before, the Saguenay definitively ruled on this and said, no, that's not the case. The opposite of starting a meeting with prayer is not starting a meeting with prayer. It would be starting a meeting with the solemn affirmation that there is no God. And so that's a very important distinction to make. And so when you abolish prayer, you're not discriminating against believers. You're simply creating a neutral public space. And just because the space was previously privileged to believers doesn't mean that it should continue to do so. And just because you incorrectly had a right doesn't mean that rectifying that situation is necessarily a harm to you. It's rectifying an oversight in rights. And that actually speaks to the final point, which is the idea of infringing on individuals' rights, right? Some people will often argue that you're stopping people from opening their meetings. They have a right to freedom of speech. They can do whatever they want. And this is not the case. In the case of municipal prayer, right? You can go and pray wherever you want. You can go outside as long as you're not interacting with people and breaking social distancing, and go pray if you'd like to. But when a public official is not entitled to use their public powers to profess their beliefs. And this is, again, reinforced by court decisions, right? And so when a municipal council invites someone to deliver a prayer in front of their council or delivers the prayer themselves, they are acting in performance of their official function, right? So when the state says, we are sanctioning this individual to deliver a prayer at this meeting, what they're doing is they're endorsing that religion and they're sanctioning the practice. And that's the problem, right? It's not that people can't meet outside of council chambers and pray beforehand or go do whatever other practices that feel appropriate to them. It's that the state is officially endorsing something which violates the state's neutrality, which is the fundamental point that Saguenay decided. So yeah, those are the arguments that we see bandied about around legislative prayer. And as you can see, Saguenay is definitive, right? Any municipality that we find that is continuing to open its sessions with prayer, inaugural or otherwise, is violating the Constitution. And so we have a very strong footing here. Sometimes we find ourselves making pleas or making complex arguments on minutia or on nuanced issues. This is not one of those cases. It's very firm. If your municipality is opening a session with prayer, it's violating the Constitution, it's excluding people, it's harming people, and it has to stop. And that's why I'm really excited to launch this project so that we can help people across the country create more inclusive municipal councils.
I saw there was one question on our other face. So there was some glitches getting the Facebook Live video going, and we ended up having 2 live videos, the first couple minutes, and then the main one that's going right now. JP Lang asked, why did the ruling only apply to the municipal level? Does another challenge have to be brought against provincial and against the federal level in order to stop those institutions from this bit of theater? And I think you touched on that, and it's exactly that courts really like sticking to the narrowest decisions they have to do. There's this question around parliamentary privilege that you touched on, that MPs and MLAs can say literally anything in the House and not getting in trouble.
There's another aspect too, if I can jump in here, Ian. So if you look at Saguenay had a couple of points to say, because they did address this, and actually Simoneau, my understanding is correct, also took because Quebec doesn't have legislative prayer. Another individual elsewhere, I won't cite the case off the top of my head because it's somewhere in my brain.
There was a case in Ontario.
That was the Ontario one.
Ontario Human Rights Commission and then Court of Appeal, I think.
That's right. So the case in Ontario where basically the individual wasn't regularly attending provincial legislative meetings, and so they didn't necessarily have the right kind of standing, which I thought was a bit of a bit fuzzy. But the other 2 points that get brought up in Saguenay, in addition to parliamentary privilege, one of them is that, and the judge hints at this, and I'm not really sure what they mean, was that the prayers in Parliament have a different intent, and that was kind of interesting. And that hasn't really been explored by courts at all, but they suggested that there was a difference between, say, the set prayer that's read at the beginning of every session of the Senate or Parliament compared to the prayers that were being delivered at the Municipal Council in Saguenay. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that's a bad argument, but it was an argument that was brought up in Saguenay. And there was a third argument I believe they mentioned. The third one Ian already mentioned, which was the case the court wanted to focus on the case in front of it, and that would have brought up a whole other issue. And they didn't really have the evidence, and the arguments were not made at the lower level that would apply at Parliament because of things like parliamentary privilege and intent. So they did not rule on it at that point. I personally, and we're working on a legal article on this, exploring the issue of parliamentary privilege. But as I mentioned, parliamentary privilege shouldn't protect discriminatory practices. And it would not make sense or be consistent with the intention of parliamentary privilege to allow it to support discrimination. And you can do the example of replace atheism with anything else: race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and suddenly it becomes very apparent. And that's exactly what a judge did in what lower level court ruling that said, like, no, if you replace this with gender, it would be totally not okay. And if that's the case, then it must also be totally not okay for differences in belief. Someone wrote down, why are you trying to take away their God-given right to force their religion on you? Yes, fair point. Exactly. That is, of course, a right they have to do on their own. But as soon as they invoke I know this is more meant tongue-in-cheek, but as soon as they evoke, by they I mean public officials, evoke the powers of the state, then they're violating religious neutrality, right? So an individual, if the mayor wants to take off his hat and go proselytize on a soapbox in the corner of the street, they're entitled to do that, although there might be some questions around like propriety and also in what official capacity they're acting in. But as soon as they're acting in an official capacity as mayor or as a councillor or as a council itself, then they represent the state, and the state has a duty of religious neutrality. But yeah, very good question. Yeah. Well, I will say before we probably wrap things up here, first of all, thank you all for joining us. We're going to try and do this regularly. We were originally intending every week, but we thought that would be a bit onerous only because research doesn't move quite that quickly. And so we'll probably run this as an occasional lecture series with updates as our projects come through, whether that's every few weeks or every month. But we really appreciate people tuning in to learn about what we're doing. And, for those of you who are members, thank you for your support. And those who aren't members, you can join the BCHA. And as Ranil mentioned, and the links are in the chat, please do sign up to participate in the project. It doesn't take a lot of time to look into a couple municipalities. It maybe takes 5 or 10 minutes. And if you're sitting at home looking for things to do between Netflix episodes, helping us promote separation of religion and government and make municipal councils more inclusive is a great use of your time, and we'll put it to good use. And just one last thing, as far as like the impact of your work, the people who transcribe prayers for the for our House of Prayers study had an impact. So just last year, at the end of last year in 2019, the BC legislature changed its procedures from prayers to prayers and reflections. Now, it's a small change, I agree, but these are parliamentary procedures that have existed for a very long time. So the fact that we've been able to open the door and make a small wedge is going to allow us to do a lot more in the future. So when you sign up for the project, this is my final pitch, I suppose, your work's going to have an impact, not just producing good academic work and impactful reports, but also will have a direct impact on people's lives, in this case, across the country, which is very exciting.